15th October 2019. Site designation redacted. Grid coordinates 39°47N, 105°52W, approximately 43 kilometers northwest of Colorado Springs, Colorado. Buried deep in the Pike National Forest at an elevation of 9,847 feet above sea level. I remember the exact numbers because I checked my Garmin 3 times that morning, each time hoping the digits would change, that somehow I'd misread them, that this wasn't really where they were sending me. But the numbers stayed the same, cold and precise against the gray plastic housing of the GPS unit, strapped to my left wrist, right below my Lumentox watch that read 547 hours Mountain Standard Time. The air temperature hovered at 38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that I could see my breath pluming in front of my face like diesel exhaust, each exhalation a ghostly reminder that I was still breathing, still alive, still very much in the world, even though everything about this place felt like I'd stepped through some invisible membrane into somewhere else entirely. The Chinook that had delivered me 90 minutes earlier was already long gone, its twin rotors having clawed back up into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving nothing but the memory of rotor wash and JP8 fumes hanging in the mountain air. I'd watched it disappear beyond the ridgeline, the red anti-collision beacon blinking 3 times before vanishing completely. And I'd felt something in my chest tighten. Not quite fear, not quite dread, but something adjacent to both. Something I'd learned to recognize over 4 combat deployments as the body's primitive warning system trying to tell the mind that danger was close. My loadout was standard for a rear echelon babysitting assignment. Stripped-down kit consisting of an Eagle plate carrier with level fee SAPI plates front and back, 3 30-round PMAG magazines loaded with M855A1 green tip for my issue, M4A1 carbine, serial number visible on the lower receiver, LE147832. A Safariland drop-leg holster containing my Sig Sauer M17 with 2 spare 17-round magazines. An IFAK, individual first aid kit, mounted on my belt at the 4 o'clock position, a camelback with 3 liters of water, and a small assault pack containing 72 hours of cold weather gear and rations. The weight of it all pressed down on my shoulders with familiar insistence, approximately 47 pounds of equipment, gear, weaponry, and government-issue survival tools that I'd grown so accustomed to over the years that I barely noticed the pressure anymore, except in quiet moments like this when I was standing still, waiting, trying to figure out what the hell I'd gotten myself into. My boots, Salomon Quest 4D GTX in Coyote Brown, broken in over 6 months of ruck marches and field exercises, were already soaking through from the morning dew that clung to the alpine meadow grass like thousands of tiny glass beads. Each blade was bent under the weight of moisture, creating a silver-gray carpet that stretched maybe 200 meters in every direction before the tree line closed in like a fist. I'd been in the Army for 14 years, 3 months, and 17 days. Staff Sergeant Marcus James Holloway, 7th Special Forces Group, Airborne, originally from Asheville, North Carolina, where the mountains were old and soft and worn down by time. Nothing like these young, sharp-toothed Colorado peaks that looked like they'd been thrust up out of the earth just yesterday by some violent geological temper tantrum. My MOS was 18D, Special Forces Medical Sergeant, which meant I'd spent the better part of a decade and a half learning how to keep people alive in places where everything seemed designed to kill them. I'd done 3 tours in Afghanistan between 2008 and 2014, 1 in Iraq in 2016, and more training rotations in various African and South American countries than I could accurately count without checking my service record. I'd pulled shrapnel out of screaming ranges in the Hindu Kush, performed a field tracheotomy on a Peshmerga fighter in northern Iraq using a ballpoint pen casing and a K-bar knife, and once spent 48 straight hours keeping a critically wounded Marine alive in a shot-up safe house in Helmand Province while we waited for CASEVAC that kept getting pushed back because of weather. I tell you all this not to brag, but to establish context, to make you understand that I wasn't some fresh-faced private who jumped at shadows or believed in boogeyman stories. I'd seen real horror, the kind that comes wrapped in cordite smoke and screaming and the wet sound of blood hitting dirt. I'd watched good men die badly, had held their hands while they gurgled their last breaths through punctured lungs, had written letters to their families explaining that their sons and husbands and fathers had died serving their country, when the truth was, they died because somebody somewhere had made a mistake with a map, or a radio frequency, or a target package. I'd developed the 1,000-yard stare, and the dark humor, and the emotional calluses that all combat veterans develop as protective measures against the accumulated weight of traumatic memory. I didn't believe in ghosts or demons or things that went bump in the night because I'd learned that the real monsters wore uniforms and followed orders and looked just like everybody else. But standing there in that alpine meadow at 05:47 hours on 15th October 2019, watching the morning fog curl up out of the tree line like something alive and predatory, I felt the first whisper of doubt creep into my certainty. Something about this place felt wrong, in a way I couldn't articulate. Couldn't point to any specific detail and say, "There, that's what's bothering me." It was more like a frequency, a subsonic vibration just below the threshold of conscious perception, the kind of thing you feel in your bones and your gut before your brain catches up to process it. The meadow was too quiet. That was the first concrete thing I could identify. No bird calls, no insect sounds, no rustling of small mammals moving through the underbrush. Just silence, thick and heavy and oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the faint creak of my gear as I shifted my weight from foot to foot. The facility itself was invisible from my position, buried beneath the southern ridgeline approximately 800 meters to my southeast. According to the briefing I'd received 48 hours earlier at Fort Bragg, the installation was officially designated as Research Station Alpha 7, though the paperwork I'd signed had referred to it only as the site, with no further elaboration. The briefing had been conducted in a windowless SCIF, sensitive compartmented information facility, by a woman in civilian clothes who'd introduced herself only as Dr. Cassidy, and who'd spent exactly 27 minutes explaining absolutely nothing of substance. I would be providing medical support for ongoing research projects of a classified nature. I would be housed in on-site barracks. I would have minimal contact with the research staff. I would not discuss my assignment with anyone outside the facility, including family members, under penalty of federal prosecution under Title 18, Section 793 of the U.S. Code, the Espionage Act. The whole thing stank of black budget bullshit, the kind of off-books operation that doesn't officially exist, and therefore can't officially fuck up. I'd asked Dr. Cassidy what kind of research required a Special Forces medical sergeant in the middle of the Colorado wilderness, and she'd given me a smile that didn't reach her eyes and told me I'd be fully briefed upon arrival. I'd asked how long the assignment would last, and she'd said approximately 6 to 8 weeks, depending on operational requirements. I'd asked if I could call my wife, and she'd said limited communication privileges will be explained during in-processing. That was when I should have known, should have pushed back, should have found some way to refuse the assignment. But you don't refuse orders in the Army, not when you're a staff sergeant with 14 years in and a pension just 6 years away. Not when you've got a wife and 2 kids and a mortgage and all the normal entanglements that keep you tethered to the machinery of military bureaucracy. So I'd signed the forms, reams of them, page after page of dense legal language and security classifications and liability waivers. And 2 days later I was sitting in the cargo bay of a CH-47F Chinook at Hunter Army Airfield in Georgia, watching the dawn break over the Atlantic as we turned west toward Colorado. The flight crew had been Air National Guard, friendly guys who'd tried to make conversation during the first hour before they realized I wasn't in a talking mood. We'd stopped once to refuel at an airbase in Kansas that I'd never heard of and couldn't find on any map when I checked later. The second leg had taken us into increasingly mountainous terrain, the pilot threading the Chinook through valleys and over ridges with the kind of casual precision that spoke to hundreds of hours in the cockpit. We'd descended into the meadow just before 0400 hours, the helo's wheels never quite touching down, hovering maybe 2 feet off the deck while I jumped out the ramp with my gear. And then they were gone, climbing hard and fast like they couldn't wait to get away from this place. I'd been standing in this meadow for an hour and 47 minutes now, and still nobody had come to meet me. The briefing packet had included grid coordinates for the landing zone and instructions to await escort to the facility, but it hadn't specified how long I'd be waiting or what the escort would look like. I'd tried my PRC-148 radio twice, cycling through the 3 frequencies that had been included in my orders, but I'd gotten nothing back except static and occasional bursts of what sounded like interference. Not quite white noise, not quite signal, something in between that made my teeth ache when I listened to it too long. My Garmin still showed the correct coordinates, so it wasn't a GPS issue. The Chinook had definitely dropped me in the right location, which meant either my escort was running late or something had changed since my orders were cut 48 hours ago. I decided to conduct a comms check using my backup system, pulling my issued Samsung Galaxy smartphone from its waterproof case in my assault pack. The phone was locked down and monitored, capable of calls only to approved numbers on a secure network, but at least it would tell me if there was any kind of cell signal out here in the wilderness. I powered it on and watched the screen glow to life. The government issue splash screen appearing for 3 seconds before the operating system loaded. No signal. Not even a single bar. No roaming, no emergency calls only, just a red X where the signal strength indicator should have been. I checked the battery level, 87%, and the settings to make sure airplane mode wasn't activated. Everything looked normal except for the complete absence of any radio signal whatsoever. I tried manually selecting a carrier, waiting while the phone searched, but after 45 seconds it gave up and displayed no networks found. That was unusual, but not unprecedented. We were deep in the wilderness, in a valley surrounded by mountains that would block most conventional cell signals. What bothered me more was the weird interference on the radio, that not quite static that seemed to pulse in irregular rhythms. I pulled out my P-Mag and performed a chamber check on my M4, confirming a round loaded and the weapon on safe, then did a brass check by pulling the charging handle back half an inch and visually verifying the gleam of copper casing in the chamber. Old habits from years of carrying a weapon in hostile territory. The ritual was comforting, a series of familiar actions that required no thought, just muscle memory and repetition. I let the bolt carrier group slam forward and seated the magazine with a firm push, feeling it click into place. Then I did a press check to make sure everything was seated properly. The sun was starting to rise now, painting the eastern sky in gradual shades of pink and orange that seemed almost obscene in their beauty. Too clean and pure for a place that felt this wrong. Long shadows stretched across the meadow, cast by the irregular tree line that surrounded me on all sides, except for a narrow gap to the southeast, where the land rose toward the hidden facility. The fog was getting thicker, not thinner, which went against everything I knew about mountain weather patterns. Fog should burn off as the sun rises, should retreat back into the valleys and low places. But this stuff seemed to be multiplying, coiling up out of the ground like smoke from hundreds of tiny fires, gathering in pools and streams that flowed uphill in defiance of physics. I watched a tendril of it curl around a granite outcropping maybe 50 meters to my left, moving with strange purpose, almost like it was searching for something. I shook my head and rubbed my eyes, blaming the weird visual phenomena on lack of sleep. I'd managed maybe 4 hours of uncomfortable dozing on the Chinook, wedged between cargo netting and a pallet of supplies, and before that, I'd been awake for 36 hours, dealing with the frantic last-minute preparation for this assignment. My wife Sarah had taken the news about as well as could be expected, which is to say badly, with tears and recriminations and pointed questions about why the Army was sending me to Colorado for training when I'd just gotten back from Africa 3 months ago and had been promised a desk rotation for at least 6 months. I hadn't had good answers for her because I didn't have good answers for myself. All I knew was that orders were orders, and you didn't refuse them unless you wanted to spend the rest of your career being punished for it in subtle and not so subtle ways. The temperature was dropping rather than rising, I realized with surprise. My watch thermometer, which had read 38 degrees when I landed, now showed 34. That didn't make any sense. The sun was up, breaking over the eastern ridge, direct light beginning to spill into the meadow. It should be warming up, not cooling down. I pulled my gloves from my cargo pocket and tugged them on, flexing my fingers to maintain dexterity. Standard issue mechanics fast-fit gloves in coyote brown, thin enough to maintain trigger control but warm enough to prevent numbness in moderate cold. I bounced on the balls of my feet a few times, getting blood flowing, generating heat through movement. My breath clouds were getting thicker, more visible, confirming the temperature drop. Something was definitely wrong with this place, wrong in ways that violated basic meteorology and physics, but I couldn't pin down exactly what or how. The briefing at Fort Bragg had lasted exactly 27 minutes from start to finish, conducted in Shift 12 on the third sublevel of the SOCOM headquarters building, a room I'd been in dozens of times before for pre-deployment intelligence updates. Dr. Cassidy had been waiting for me when I arrived, sitting alone at the head of a conference table that could seat 20 people, a single manila folder in front of her and nothing else. No laptop, no tablet, no paperwork visible except that one folder. She was maybe 45 years old, though it was hard to tell with certainty. She had the kind of ageless quality that came from either excellent genetics or expensive cosmetic work or both. Dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, black pantsuit that looked expensive, no jewelry except for a plain wedding band that might have been white gold or platinum, no visible security badge, no DoD credentials on a lanyard, nothing to indicate who she worked for or what agency had authorized her presence in a Special Operations Command facility. I'd sat down across from her after checking the skiff door was properly sealed. The magnetic indicators all showed green, confirming we were in a properly secured space where no electronic eavesdropping was possible, and waited for her to speak first. That's basic intelligence protocol when you're the subject matter expert being briefed by someone you've never met, who won't provide proper credentials. You let them establish the parameters of the conversation. Let them show their hand. Let them reveal how much they know and how much they're willing to share. Dr. Cassidy had seemed to appreciate my silence, nodding slightly as if confirming some internal assessment. And then she'd opened the manila folder and slid a single photograph across the table toward me. It was an 8x10 glossy print, high resolution, showing an aerial view of mountainous terrain that could have been anywhere in the American West. Dense pine forest, granite outcroppings, snowpack on the higher elevations. A black circle had been drawn in marker on the photograph, highlighting an area that looked like natural terrain, except for some subtle geometric regularities if you looked closely. Straight lines where there shouldn't be straight lines. Right angles in nature's curves. Research Station Alpha 7, Dr. Cassidy had said in a voice that carried no inflection, no emotion, just flat declarative facts delivered in sequence. Officially, it doesn't exist. The land is listed as Pike National Forest, closed to public access due to wildlife preservation efforts. Unofficially, it's a Department of Defense research facility operating under Special Access Program protocols with a staff of approximately 47 personnel, including scientists, support staff, security, and rotating military liaison officers. Your assignment is to serve as medical support for a period of 6 to 8 weeks, providing both routine healthcare and emergency trauma response as needed. You will report directly to the facility commander, Colonel Marcus Vance, upon arrival. You will be housed in on-site barracks. You will have access to a fully equipped medical facility including surgical suite, pharmacy, and diagnostic equipment. Your duties will include daily sick call, periodic health screenings of research staff, and standby status for any medical emergencies that may arise. 19. I had waited for her to continue, but she'd simply looked at me with those flat, unreadable eyes, waiting for questions. So I'd asked the obvious one. What kind of research requires a Special Forces medic? She'd closed the folder with deliberate precision, aligning the edges until they were perfectly square to the table's edge, and then she'd met my gaze directly. The research is classified above your current clearance level. What you need to know is that the work involves human subjects who require specialized medical monitoring. Your combat trauma experience and advanced medical training make you uniquely qualified to handle any emergencies that might arise. The facility's previous medical officer rotated out last month, and his replacement won't arrive for another 8 weeks. You're filling a gap in coverage, Nothing more complicated than that. 20. But it was more complicated than that. It had to be. The Army had thousands of medics, hundreds of them with combat experience and advanced training. Why pull a Special Forces medical sergeant from 7th Group for what sounded like a glorified sick call rotation? Why the elaborate SCIF briefing? Why the secrecy and the Special Access Program protocols and the complete absence of any useful information about what I'd actually be doing? I'd asked about communications, about whether I could call home, and Dr. Cassidy had explained that the facility had limited communications capability due to its remote location. I would be able to send 1 email per week, subject to security review, and receive 1 email per week under the same restrictions. No phone calls, no video chats, no social media, no unauthorized electronic devices. Everything I brought with me would be inspected and potentially confiscated if it violated security protocols. 21. I'd asked about the research subjects, about what kind of medical issues I might expect to encounter, and Dr. Cassidy had given me that smile again. Not warm, not cold, just a facial expression that contained no emotional content whatsoever, and told me that I would receive a full medical briefing from the facility's chief researcher upon arrival. I'd asked about chain of command, about who I'd report to if there was a conflict between medical ethics and operational requirements, and she'd told me that Colonel Vance had final authority on all matters related to facility operations, but that I should document any ethical concerns in writing and submit them through proper channels. Which was government speak for do what you're told or face consequences. I'd asked about duration, about whether 6 to 8 weeks was firm or might extend longer, and she'd said that the assignment was officially listed as temporary duty in support of ongoing operations, with no specified end date beyond the estimated timeline. 22. Then she'd produced the paperwork. Forms printed on special stock, marked with classification headers I'd never seen before. Not just secret or top secret, but designations like Umbra Restricted and SAP Acknowledged, and codes I didn't recognize. Non-disclosure agreements that seemed to go on for pages, outlining criminal penalties for unauthorized disclosure that included up to 25 years in federal prison. Liability waivers acknowledging that I understood the assignment involved inherent risks associated with classified research activities, and that I would not hold the government responsible for any injury, disability, or death that occurred during the performance of my duties. Consent forms authorizing the government to monitor all my communications, to search my person and belongings at any time without warrant or probable cause, to detain me for questioning if security concerns arose. Each form required my signature, my printed name, my social security number, my security clearance level, and a thumbprint in the designated box. I'd hesitated over the liability waiver, reading the language carefully. Inherent risks associated with classified research activities could mean anything from exposure to chemical agents, to infectious disease, to kinetic accidents involving experimental weapons. The form provided no specifics, just broad categories of potential harm. I'd asked Dr. Cassidy what specific risks I should be aware of, and she'd told me that the information was classified and would be revealed on a need-to-know basis after my arrival at the facility. I'd pointed out that I couldn't give informed consent to risks I didn't know about, and she'd responded that my consent wasn't technically required. My orders to report to Research Station Alpha 7 were already cut and approved by my chain of command. The forms were merely documentation of my acknowledgement of security protocols. I could refuse to sign them, but that would constitute failure to follow lawful orders and would result in disciplinary action up to and including court-martial. So I'd signed them all, one after another, my hand moving almost automatically through the repetitive ritual of signature and print and thumbprint. My handwriting looked strange on the special stock paper, the ink seeming to sink into the fibers with unusual darkness, as if the paper were designed to hold on to information with extra tenacity. Dr. Cassidy had collected each form as I finished it, straightening it against the table edge before placing it in the manila folder, building a neat stack of legally binding documents that felt like chains being locked around me, one link at a time. When I'd signed the last form, she'd closed the folder, stood up, and extended her hand for a professional handshake. Her grip was firm but not aggressive, her palm dry and cool, her fingers applying exactly the right amount of pressure for exactly the right duration before releasing. She'd told me that a vehicle would collect me from my residence at 0400 hours in 2 days for transport to Hunter Army Airfield. That I should pack only essential personal items, as most gear would be provided at the facility, and that I should not discuss the assignment with anyone, including family members. I'd returned home that evening, feeling like I'd just signed my soul over to the devil, except I wasn't even sure who the devil was in this scenario. Sarah had known immediately that something was wrong. 14 years of marriage had given her a finely tuned antenna for my moods and concerns, and she'd pressed me for details over dinner, while our kids, Emily and Marcus Jr., 11 and 8 years old respectively, argued about whose turn it was to load the dishwasher. I'd told her it was a training rotation in Colorado. Nothing dangerous, just medical support for a field exercise. Would be back in 6 to 8 weeks. She'd asked why I couldn't tell her more details, and I'd explained that it was classified, that I'd signed NDAs, that I couldn't talk about it even if I wanted to. She'd gotten that look in her eyes, the one that said she knew I was holding something back, but had learned over the years that pushing too hard would only make me shut down completely. The next 48 hours had been a blur of preparation and suppressed anxiety. I'd packed my assault pack with cold weather gear, toiletries, a paperback copy of Blood Meridian that I'd been meaning to reread, a small photo album with pictures of Sarah and the kids, and a journal I'd kept sporadically over the years whenever I felt the need to process my experiences in writing. I'd checked my issued gear 3 times, making sure everything was clean and functional, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything that might be difficult to replace in a remote location. I'd updated my will and life insurance beneficiaries, a grim ritual that had become automatic before any deployment or extended assignment. I'd spent an hour playing video games with Marcus Jr., watching Emily practice her soccer drills in the backyard, helping Sarah cook a nice dinner that none of us had much appetite for. I'd made love to my wife with a desperation that had probably alarmed her, holding her afterward in the darkness of our bedroom and memorizing the feel of her body against mine, the sound of her breathing, the smell of her shampoo on the pillow. Then the van had arrived at 400 hours exactly, a white unmarked cargo vehicle with tinted windows and no government plates, driven by a silent contractor in civilian clothes who'd taken my gear and waited patiently while I kissed Sarah goodbye on our front porch in the pre-dawn darkness. She'd been crying silently, tears running down her face while she tried to smile and tell me to stay safe and come home soon. I'd promised her I would, knowing, even as I said it, that it might be a lie, that I had no idea what I was walking into, that whatever Research Station Alpha 7 really was, it wasn't a normal rotation, and it wasn't a safe assignment, and every instinct I'd developed over 14 years in the military was screaming at me to refuse the orders and accept the court-martial. But I'd gotten in the van anyway, because that's what soldiers do. We follow orders. We go where we're sent. We trust that someone higher up the chain of command knows what they're doing and has our best interests at heart, even when all evidence suggests otherwise. The flight to Colorado had given me time to think, time to replay the briefing in my mind and try to identify what Dr. Cassidy hadn't told me. The classified research involving human subjects, the need for combat trauma experience, the liability waivers acknowledging risk of injury or death, the complete communications blackout except for weekly monitored emails, the facility that officially didn't exist, hidden in the wilderness under wildlife preservation cover. All of it added up to something seriously wrong, something that violated basic ethical standards, something that the government didn't want anyone to know about. Human medical experimentation. That's what this had to be. Some kind of program testing drugs or procedures or technologies on human volunteers. Or maybe not volunteers. Maybe that was the secret. Maybe the subjects weren't willing participants but prisoners or mental patients or homeless people who'd been disappeared into the system. I'd tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that there were legitimate reasons for classified medical research, that I was jumping to conclusions based on incomplete information. We'd done medical research on service members for decades, testing everything from high-altitude performance to disease resistance to psychological resilience under extreme stress. Most of it was ethically conducted with proper consent and oversight, but some of it wasn't. I knew the history. MK Ultra and Operation Midnight Climax and the Tuskegee experiments, and all the other times the government had decided that the greater good justified treating human beings like laboratory animals. I'd learned about it in advanced medical training, had written papers on the importance of ethical standards and informed consent, had sworn oaths to do no harm. And now I was flying toward a facility that specialized in precisely the kind of research that required human subjects to be hidden away in the wilderness, where nobody could see what was being done to them. But what choice did I have? I was 14 years into a military career, 6 years from retirement, and a pension that would support my family for the rest of our lives. I had 2 kids in school and a mortgage and car payments, and all the normal financial obligations that come with middle-class American life. I couldn't just refuse the assignment without destroying everything I'd worked for, without abandoning my family to poverty and uncertainty. So I'd swallowed my doubts and my fears and my ethical objections, had wrapped them up tight and locked them away in the same mental compartment where I kept all the other things I didn't want to think about. The faces of men I'd killed in combat. The screams of wounded soldiers I couldn't save. The knowledge that I'd spent more than a decade of my life serving a military machine that frequently treated human beings as expendable resources in geopolitical games I didn't fully understand. The Chinook had descended into the meadow at precisely 0400 hours, exactly on schedule, the pilots navigating by NVGs through mountain valleys in complete darkness, with the kind of casual precision that spoke to extensive training and familiarity with the route. I'd gathered my gear and prepared to jump from the ramp, while the crew chief gave me a thumbs up and shouted something I couldn't hear over the rotor noise. The helicopter had barely touched down, wheels kissing grass for maybe 2 seconds before the pilot applied power again and lifted off, climbing hard and fast like they couldn't wait to get away from this place. I'd watched them go, standing alone in the darkness with my rifle and my doubts, watching the anti-collision beacon blink 3 times before disappearing beyond the ridgeline. And then I'd been truly alone in a way I hadn't experienced since my last combat deployment. And I'd been alone ever since, standing in this meadow for almost 2 hours now, watching the sun rise and the temperature drop and the fog multiply in defiance of natural laws. My watch read 0553 hours. My radio was still producing nothing but weird interference when I cycled through the assigned frequencies. My phone still showed no signal. My GPS still confirmed I was in the right location. And still nobody had come to escort me to the facility. I was starting to consider the possibility that this was some kind of test, that Dr. Cassidy and Colonel Vance and whoever else was involved in this operation wanted to see how I'd handle uncertainty and isolation, wanted to measure my psychological resilience before allowing me access to whatever secrets were hidden beneath that southern ridgeline. Or maybe something had gone wrong. Maybe there'd been an accident at the facility, a containment breach or equipment failure, or security incident that had required all personnel to focus on crisis response instead of meeting the new medic. I decided to give it another hour. If nobody showed up by 0700 hours, I'd start moving toward the facility on my own, following the terrain features toward the grid coordinates that had been marked on the map in my briefing packet. It was approximately 800 meters to the southeast, which meant maybe 20 minutes of movement through light forest terrain if I maintained tactical awareness and didn't rush. I checked my watch again, 0555 hours. And then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in this silent wilderness. Footsteps. Multiple sets of them, moving through the forest to my east, approaching at a steady pace that suggested discipline and purpose. I turned toward the sound, bringing my M4 up to low ready, not quite pointing it at the threat, but prepared to engage if necessary. My thumb found the selector switch and clicked it from safe to semi, muscle memory taking over before my conscious mind fully processed what I was doing. 34. 3 figures emerged from the tree line approximately 50 meters away, moving in a modified wedge formation that marked them as military or paramilitary. They were wearing multicam uniforms with no visible rank insignia or unit patches, plate carriers that looked like IOTV or similar heavy-duty body armor, helmets with NVG mounts, and load-bearing gear that suggested they were configured for sustained operations rather than quick response. Each carried an M4 variant with optics and accessories. I could see EOTech holographic sights, PEQ-15 IR lasers, surefire weapon lights, and moved with the kind of practiced ease that spoke to extensive training and field experience. The lead figure raised one hand in a stop signal, and the formation halted, spacing themselves at approximately 5-meter intervals, maintaining security sectors that covered 360 degrees. Professional, disciplined. Exactly what I'd expect from elite security personnel protecting a classified facility. 35. The lead figure lowered their weapon to patrol carry and approached me at a measured pace, stopping about 10 meters away to call out in a voice that carried clearly across the morning air. "Staff Sergeant Holloway." I confirmed my identity and asked for theirs. The figure reached up and removed their helmet, revealing a woman's face, maybe 35 years old, dark hair cut short in a practical style, eyes that looked like they'd seen their share of shit and weren't impressed by much of anything anymore. "Captain Sarah Chen," she said, though she offered no salute and no unit identification. "I'm facility security. Sorry for the delay in meeting you. We had an incident last night that required all personnel to remain inside the perimeter until the all-clear was given. Colonel Vance sends his apologies and asked me to escort you to the facility for in-processing." 36. An incident. That was the second concerning piece of information I'd received in less than 5 minutes. The first was the fact that they'd left me standing in an unsecured meadow for 2 hours while they dealt with whatever the incident had been. The third was the way Captain Chen's 2 companions hadn't relaxed their security posture even slightly, hadn't acknowledged my presence, were still scanning their sectors like they expected contact at any moment. I asked what kind of incident, and Chen's expression closed down like a door slamming shut. "Classified," she said flatly. "The Colonel will brief you during in-processing. We need to move now. The facility is 800 meters southeast of this position, approximately 20 minutes travel time. Stay between me and my teammates, maintain noise discipline, and do not deviate from the route I mark." Understood. 37. I understood that I was being given orders rather than information, that Captain Chen had no intention of explaining anything until we were safely inside whatever perimeter protected Research Station Alpha 7, that the security posture suggested a threat level considerably higher than I'd expected for a research facility in the middle of Colorado. I nodded my compliance and fell into formation between Chen and her trailing teammate, maintaining approximately 5 meters separation while we moved toward the tree line. The third member of Chen's team took point position, moving with the kind of smooth efficiency that suggested extensive experience in tactical movement. We entered the forest in single file, transitioning from the open meadow into the shadows and vertical complexity of pine forest. The temperature dropped noticeably as we passed beneath the canopy, and the fog that had been so prevalent in the meadow seemed to intensify, coiling around tree trunks and collecting in depressions with that same unnatural purposefulness I'd noticed earlier. The forest was as silent as the meadow had been. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small mammals disturbed by our passage. Just the sound of our footsteps on pine needles and the occasional creak of gear, and the weird subsonic pressure that seemed to press against my eardrums like changes in altitude. Except we were moving on relatively level terrain, following what looked like a game trail that wound between massive ponderosa pines and Douglas firs. The trees here were old growth, their trunks easily 4 or 5 feet in diameter, their canopy so dense that very little direct sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. Everything was cast in a kind of perpetual twilight, green-gray shadows that made depth perception difficult and turned the forest into a maze of vertical columns extending into darkness above and below. Captain Chen moved with practiced efficiency, her M4 held at low ready, eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead while her head moved in slow, deliberate sweeps that covered her entire sector. Every 20 or 30 meters she would stop and raise a closed fist, signaling the formation to halt while she listened and observed. During these pauses, I could feel my heart rate accelerating slightly, adrenaline beginning to trickle into my bloodstream in response to the obvious tension radiating from Chen and her team. These weren't people conducting a routine escort. These were people expecting contact, preparing for violence, moving through terrain they considered hostile. The point man, I still hadn't gotten a good look at his face beneath his helmet, was carrying his weapon at high ready, stock welded to his shoulder, muzzle tracking his eyeline as he scanned the forest. That's a posture you maintain when you expect to shoot something within the next few seconds, not when you're walking through friendly territory. After the third security halt, I moved up closer to Captain Chen and spoke quietly, keeping my voice low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond our immediate vicinity. "Captain, what exactly are we expecting to make contact with out here? Bears? Mountain lions?" She glanced back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not annoyance, exactly. Not fear. Something more like resignation mixed with dark humor. "Nothing natural," she said. And then she resumed movement before I could ask what the hell that meant. Nothing natural. What did that mean in this context? Human threats? Some kind of security breach from a hostile intelligence service? Environmental hazards like chemical contamination or radiation? Or something else entirely? Something that explained the complete absence of wildlife and the weird atmospheric phenomena I'd been observing since I landed. The trail began to descend, following the natural contour of the terrain as we moved toward what I assumed was a valley or depression where the facility was hidden. The fog was getting thicker as we descended, reducing visibility to maybe 30 or 40 meters, transforming the forest into a claustrophobic tunnel of gray mist and dark tree trunks. My nods, night observation devices, were mounted on my helmet rail, but I hadn't activated them since we were still operating in daylight, albeit very dim filtered daylight. I considered pulling them down now to see if the infrared spectrum would give me better visibility through the fog, but Chen hadn't given any such order, and I didn't want to violate protocol by making unauthorized equipment changes during movement. So I maintained my position in formation and tried to calm the growing unease that was settling into my gut like a cold stone. We'd been moving for approximately 12 minutes when the point man raised his fist again, this time with more urgency, his entire body tensing into a combat crouch. The formation halted immediately, and I watched Chen bring her rifle up to her shoulder, clicking her selector switch to what I assumed was full auto rather than semi. Her breathing changed, becoming more controlled and deliberate, the way you breathe when you're preparing to engage a target. The trail soldier, I still couldn't see his or her face clearly, had rotated to face our 6 o'clock, covering our rear while the point man and Chen focused forward. I brought my own M4 up to ready position and clicked off my safety, my thumb resting lightly on the selector switch, prepared to engage if necessary, though I had no idea what I'd be engaging against. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Chen spoke into her radio, her voice barely a whisper. "Sierra 6, this is Sierra 2. We have possible contact at grid 734289. Holding position, requesting guidance, over." Static crackled in response, followed by a male voice that sounded distorted, either by radio interference or by some kind of encryption. "Sierra 2, Sierra 6. Maintain position, observe and report. Do not engage unless engaged. Confirm, over." Chen acknowledged the order, and we waited, frozen in place, weapons at the ready, eyes straining to penetrate the fog that seemed to be actively resisting our attempts to see through it. I wanted to ask what we were looking at, what possible contact meant, but I maintained noise discipline and scanned my own sector, the left flank, roughly 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock, looking for any sign of movement or threat. Then I saw it. Just a flicker at first, at the very edge of my peripheral vision, movement that didn't quite match the natural sway of branches or the drift of fog. I turned my head slowly, bringing my primary vision to bear on the area where I detected the movement, and for just a moment, maybe half a second, maybe less, I saw a shape that my brain couldn't quite process. It was roughly human-sized, maybe 6 feet tall, but the proportions were wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. The limbs were too long, the torso was too narrow, the head was the wrong shape, elongated somehow, Or maybe that was just a trick of the fog and shadows. And then it was gone, not moving away but simply ceasing to exist in my visual field, like it had never been there at all except for the rapidly fading afterimage burned into my retinas. I keyed my throat mic. I'd been given a PRC-148 with a tactical headset before leaving Fort Bragg, standard issue for any operation requiring secure communications, and reported what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, keeping my voice calm and professional despite the fact that my pulse was now hammering at probably 120 beats per minute. Sierra 2, this is Sierra 4. I have visual on unknown entity, left flank, approximately 40 meters, advise. Chen acknowledged my transmission with a single click of her push-to-talk button. The universal signal for message received, maintain radio silence. The point man shifted his position slightly, angling his weapon toward the area I'd indicated, and I watched his body language change from ready alertness to something more primal, not quite fear, but definitely heightened stress response, muscles coiled tight, like a compressed spring. Another minute passed. The shape didn't reappear. The forest remained silent except for the faint whisper of wind through pine needles and the subsonic pressure that continued to pulse against my eardrums in irregular rhythms. Chen finally gave the hand signal to resume movement, and we started forward again, but the tactical spacing had tightened noticeably. Where before we'd maintained 5-meter intervals, now we were maybe 3 meters apart, close enough for mutual support if contact occurred, close enough that we could physically reach each other if someone was hit and needed immediate casualty care. The point man was moving slower now, his rifle sweeping left and right in controlled arcs, checking every shadow, every depression, every tree trunk large enough to conceal a human-sized threat. 5 minutes later, the trail opened up into a small clearing, maybe 20 meters across, and I got my first look at Research Station Alpha 7. Except it wasn't what I'd expected at all. The briefing packet had included a single grainy photograph showing what looked like a typical military installation, some above-ground structures, probably support buildings and barracks, maybe a communications array, the usual administrative and logistical infrastructure you'd expect at any remote facility. But what I was looking at now was almost entirely invisible from above. The clearing contained a single building, a low rectangular structure maybe 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, constructed from what looked like standard CMU, concrete masonry unit blocks, and painted in mottled greens and browns that helped it blend into the forest background. There were no windows. A single steel door on the near side painted the same camouflage pattern as the walls. No visible communications antennas, no power lines, no external HVAC units or generators. Nothing that would make it stand out from the air or register on satellite imagery as anything other than a wildlife observation post or forestry service structure. But the real facility wasn't this building. It was underground. I could see the evidence now that I knew what to look for. The ground around the structure was too level, too carefully graded, suggesting excavation work that had been meticulously concealed. The natural rock outcroppings that ringed the clearing were positioned too perfectly, creating a natural sound and visual barrier that would deflect casual observation. And there, just barely visible at the base of the structure, I could see the edges of what looked like blast doors, the kind of massive steel-reinforced portals you'd use to seal a bunker or underground facility against everything from nuclear strikes to chemical contamination. This wasn't a research station. This was a hardened military installation buried beneath tons of rock and earth, designed to survive direct attack and to keep whatever was inside from getting out. Captain Chen led us directly to the steel door, which opened before we reached it. Someone inside had been watching our approach via cameras I couldn't see, but knew had to be there, hidden in the trees or built into the structure itself in ways that rendered them nearly invisible. A man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against harsh fluorescent light from within, and as we got closer, I could make out details. Army uniform, multicam pattern, colonel's eagles on his chest, age maybe 55 or 60, gray hair cut high and tight in a regulation fade, face that looked like it had been carved from weathered granite by a sculptor who specialized in depicting suffering and determination. This had to be Colonel Marcus Vance, the facility commander Dr. Cassidy had mentioned in the briefing. "Staff Sergeant Holloway," he said, his voice carrying the flat, authoritative tone of a man who'd spent decades giving orders and expecting immediate compliance. "Welcome to Site Alpha 7. I apologize for the unorthodox reception. We had an incident last night that required implementation of emergency security protocols. Captain Chen, good work on the escort. Get your team to the security office for debrief. Sergeant Holloway, you're with me." He stepped aside and gestured for me to enter, and I followed him through the doorway into a small anteroom that looked like an airlock or security checkpoint. The door closed behind me with a heavy metallic thunk that spoke to serious engineering. This wasn't a standard commercial door. This was a vault door, the kind of barrier designed to contain or exclude threats that conventional construction couldn't handle. The anteroom was maybe 10 feet square, with another door on the far side that was currently closed and locked. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh white illumination that made the space feel clinical and sterile. There was a security desk with multiple monitors showing camera feeds from various locations. I caught glimpses of corridors, rooms, outdoor areas, and 2 soldiers in full combat gear standing at parade rest on either side of the interior door. Colonel Vance moved to the desk and picked up what looked like a security badge on a lanyard, examining it briefly before handing it to me. "This is your facility access credential. It's coded to your biometric data and will grant you access to medical spaces, common areas, and your assigned quarters. Do not attempt to enter any area marked with red signage. Those spaces are restricted to authorized personnel only, and attempting to access them will result in immediate security response and possible detention." I took the badge and looped it over my neck, feeling the weight of it settle against my chest. It was heavier than a standard CAC, common access card, made from some kind of reinforced material rather than plastic, with a photo of me that had been taken during my in-processing at Fort Bragg, though I didn't remember sitting for any official photography session. My name, rank, and a series of alphanumeric codes were printed below the photo, along with a barcode and what looked like an RFID chip embedded in the badge material. Colonel Vance gestured to one of the security guards, who stepped forward and produced a tablet computer. "Place your right hand on the screen," Vance instructed, and I complied, pressing my palm against the smooth glass surface while the tablet scanned my handprint, capturing the unique pattern of lines and whorls and calluses that would serve as biometric identification. The process repeated with my left hand, then with facial recognition software that had me stare directly into the tablet's camera while it mapped the geometry of my features, then with a retinal scan that required me to lean in close while a red laser swept across my right eye. The whole process took maybe 3 minutes and felt invasive in ways I couldn't quite articulate, like I was being digitally dissected and cataloged, my physical identity reduced to data points that would be stored in some classified database for purposes I couldn't predict or control. When it was finished, the guard nodded to Colonel Vance and stepped back to his position. "Biometric registration complete," Vance said. "Your credentials are now active. Follow me, and I'll give you the orientation tour before showing you to medical." The interior door unlocked with a heavy mechanical clunk, and Vance pushed it open, revealing a corridor that looked nothing like the rustic exterior of the surface structure. This was serious engineering, military-grade construction designed for durability and security rather than aesthetics. The walls were poured concrete, painted institutional gray, lined with conduit runs and cable trays carrying power and data connections to various systems. The floor was polished concrete, with painted yellow safety lines marking the edges of the walkway. Overhead, fluorescent fixtures provided harsh, even illumination, backed up by red emergency lighting at regular intervals. The corridor sloped downward at maybe a 5-degree angle, leading deeper underground, and I could see heavy blast doors at 2 points along its length, currently retracted into wall recesses, but ready to slam shut and seal off sections of the facility if necessary. We walked in silence for approximately 50 meters, passing through the first blast door threshold. I noticed it was at least 8 inches thick. Solid steel reinforced with what looked like additional armor plating, mounted on hydraulic rams capable of closing it in under 3 seconds, and entered what appeared to be the main administrative level of the facility. The corridor here branched off into multiple directions, each branch marked with color-coded signage: green for common areas and support spaces, yellow for administrative offices, blue for medical and life support, red for restricted areas. Colonel Vance led me down the blue corridor, walking at a measured pace while he delivered what sounded like a well-rehearsed orientation briefing. Research Station Alpha 7 is a Department of Defense Special Access Program facility conducting classified research into human performance enhancement under extreme conditions, he said, his voice echoing slightly in the concrete corridor. The facility has been operational since 2014 and currently houses 47 personnel, including research staff, medical support, security, and administrative personnel. We operate on a 6-week rotation schedule with limited external communication to maintain operational security. Your role here is to provide medical support for facility personnel and to monitor the health status of research subjects participating in ongoing studies. You'll have access to a fully equipped medical suite, including examination rooms, a small surgical theater, diagnostic equipment, and a pharmacy stocked with both routine medications and specialized compounds developed specifically for our research protocols. Human performance enhancement. That was a broad category that could include everything from physical conditioning and nutritional optimization to pharmaceutical interventions and psychological manipulation. I asked what specific types of enhancement the research focused on, and Colonel Vance's expression hardened slightly. That information is compartmentalized and will be provided on a need-to-know basis as your duties require. For now, understand that you'll be conducting routine medical monitoring, vital signs, blood work, physical examinations, psychological assessments, and documenting any deviations from baseline parameters. You'll report your findings directly to me and to Dr. Richard Klein, our chief researcher. Any questions or concerns you have about the research protocol should be directed through proper channels, meaning myself or Dr. Klein, not discussed with other facility personnel or documented in any unofficial capacity. We passed through another blast door and entered what was clearly the medical level. The corridor here was wider, painted in a pale green that was probably meant to be calming but came across as vaguely nauseating under the fluorescent lights. Multiple doors branched off on both sides, each marked with clear signage. Examination Room 1, Examination Room 2, Diagnostic Lab, Pharmacy, Surgical Suite, Recovery Ward, Medical Storage. At the far end of the corridor, I could see a larger set of double doors marked Subject Housing, Authorized Personnel Only, in red letters that seemed to glow with unusual intensity. Colonel Vance noticed my attention and steered me away from those doors, guiding me instead toward the examination rooms. Your primary workspace will be Examination Room 1, he explained, opening the door to reveal a space that looked like any civilian doctor's office. Examination table with sanitary paper, rolling stool, computer workstation, cabinets containing supplies, sink with soap and paper towel dispensers. The standard medical equipment you'd expect. You'll conduct sick call here every morning at 0800 hours for facility personnel. We average maybe 3 to 5 patients per day, mostly minor complaints, colds, minor injuries, routine prescription refills, that sort of thing. In addition, you'll perform weekly health assessments on research subjects, according to a schedule that Dr. Klein will provide. Those assessments are more comprehensive and will require blood draws, cardiovascular monitoring, neurological examination, and psychological screening using standardized instruments. I stepped into the examination room and looked around, taking in details that would become familiar over the coming weeks. Everything looked new, well-maintained, properly stocked. The computer on the workstation was a standard Dell desktop with dual monitors, keyboard, mouse, and what looked like a KAC reader for secure login. Medical supplies in the cabinets were organized and labeled, Expiration dates all current. Inventory levels appropriate for a facility this size. The examination table was a modern hydraulic model, easily adjusted for height and patient positioning. A Welch Allen diagnostic set was mounted on the wall, complete with otoscope, ophthalmoscope, and blood pressure cuff. A crash cart stood in the corner, stocked with emergency medications and airway management equipment. On the surface, this looked like a completely legitimate and well-run medical facility. But something felt wrong. I couldn't identify what exactly. The room looked perfect. Too perfect, maybe. Like a movie set designed to convey medical facility, without any of the accumulated clutter and personalization that came from actual daily use. The supplies were too neatly organized. The computer looked like it had never been touched. The floor was too clean, no scuff marks from rolling stools or equipment, no wear patterns from foot traffic. This room had either been set up very recently, or was maintained to an unrealistic standard that suggested it saw very little actual use. I asked Colonel Vance when the previous medical officer had departed, and he paused for just a fraction of a second before answering, long enough that I knew he was choosing his words carefully. Captain Rodriguez rotated out approximately 6 weeks ago, Vance said. He completed his assignment and returned to his parent unit. The facility has been managing with minimal medical coverage since then. We have 2 qualified combat lifesavers on the security team who've been handling routine sick call, but we need a qualified medical professional for the research protocols. That's where you come in. 6 weeks seemed like a long time to operate a facility like this without proper medical support, especially if they were conducting human subject research that required ongoing health monitoring. I asked if there had been any medical emergencies during that 6-week period, and again I saw that fractional pause before Vance responded. Nothing that couldn't be handled with our available resources. We have a standing medevac protocol with Peterson Air Force Base if we need to evacuate someone for trauma care beyond our organic capability. The conversation felt like it was being carefully managed, like Colonel Vance was feeding me just enough information to satisfy basic questions while avoiding anything substantive about what actually happened at Research Station Alpha 7. I decided to push a little harder to see how much I could learn before Vance shut me down completely. Sir, with respect, I need to understand what I'm getting into here. Dr. Cassidy's briefing at Bragg was extremely vague about the nature of the research. Human performance enhancement is a broad category. Are we talking about pharmaceutical trials, psychological conditioning, physical augmentation? I need to know what medical issues I should be prepared to handle so I can ensure I have the right training and the right equipment. Colonel Vance turned to face me directly, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd seen before in the eyes of other officers who'd been forced to make impossible decisions in impossible situations. It wasn't quite guilt, not quite shame, but something related to both. The look of a man who knew he was involved in something morally questionable, but had rationalized it as necessary for reasons he couldn't or wouldn't articulate. Staff Sergeant Holloway, he said quietly, there are aspects of this program that I cannot discuss with you until you've been fully integrated into facility operations and have demonstrated that you can maintain operational security. What I can tell you is that the research here is critically important to national security, that it's been approved at the highest levels of the Department of Defense, and that every subject participating in our studies has volunteered and signed informed consent documents acknowledging the risks involved. Your job is to monitor their health and to document any adverse effects so we can adjust protocols as needed. That's all you need to know for now. Volunteered, signed consent documents. The phrasing was interesting because it was technically true of almost every unethical medical experiment in history. Subjects had volunteered after being pressured or misled or given no real alternative, had signed consent documents that obscured the true risks or nature of what they were agreeing to. I wanted to challenge Vance's statement, wanted to demand real answers about what was happening here. But I was also a staff sergeant talking to a full colonel, which meant I had exactly zero leverage in this conversation. So I nodded my acknowledgement and followed Vance as he continued the tour, showing me the diagnostic lab with its impressive array of equipment: blood analyzers, centrifuges, microscopes, a small X-ray machine, an ultrasound unit, even a portable CT scanner that must have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The pharmacy was similarly well stocked, with entire cabinets devoted to medications I recognized from combat casualty care: opioid analgesics, antibiotics, antipsychotics, anticonvulsants, various emergency drugs like epinephrine and atropine, along with several locked cabinets containing drugs I didn't immediately recognize. I asked about those, and Vance explained they were specialized compounds developed for specific research protocols, and that I'd receive briefings on their use and side effects as needed. He showed me the surgical suite, a small but fully equipped operating room with a surgical table, anesthesia machine, surgical lights, and instrument trays that suggested capability for everything from minor procedures to major trauma surgery. He showed me the recovery ward, which contained 6 hospital beds separated by curtain dividers, each bed equipped with full monitoring capability, cardiac leads, pulse oximetry, blood pressure cuffs, all feeding to a central monitoring station. And then he showed me the door at the end of the corridor, the one marked "Subject Housing Authorized Personnel Only" in those strangely glowing red letters. Vance didn't open it, didn't even approach within 10 feet of it, but he gestured toward it and explained that this was where the research subjects were housed during their participation in the program. "You'll be conducting your weekly health assessments in dedicated examination rooms beyond those doors," he said. "Dr. Klein will escort you for your first few visits until you're familiar with the protocols and security procedures. The subjects are housed in individual rooms with full amenities, beds, bathrooms, entertainment systems, and are provided with meals and recreational opportunities appropriate to their status. They're not prisoners, Sergeant. They're volunteers participating in research that may save thousands of lives in future conflicts." The phrasing was careful, defensive, like Vance was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. I looked at the door, at those red letters that seemed to pulse with their own light source, and I felt that cold stone in my gut grow heavier. Whatever was behind that door, whatever these volunteers were being subjected to, it was the real heart of Research Station Alpha 7. Everything else, the administrative spaces, the common areas, the well-equipped medical suite, was just infrastructure supporting whatever happened in subject housing. I wanted to ask more questions, but Vance was already turning away, already moving to show me the rest of the facility, and I understood that the tour of subject housing would wait until I'd been properly indoctrinated into whatever moral compromises were required to work here. Vance showed me the security office, a small room filled with monitors displaying camera feeds from dozens of locations throughout the facility and the surrounding forest. 3 soldiers sat at monitoring stations, watching the screens with the kind of focused attention that spoke to genuine threat assessment rather than routine guard duty. I recognized Captain Chen among them, now without her helmet, looking tired but alert as she typed up what I assumed was the after-action report from our encounter in the forest. Vance introduced me to the security team leader, a master sergeant named David Reyes who looked like he'd spent about 20 years in the infantry before ending up here. Reyes gave me a firm handshake and a measuring look that suggested he was cataloging my capabilities and potential weaknesses, the way experienced NCOs do when meeting someone new who might become a liability or an asset. "Sergeant Holloway will be our new medical officer for the next 6 to 8 weeks, Vance explained. "Make sure he gets briefed on emergency procedures and evacuation protocols. If we have a medical emergency that requires his immediate response, I need him to be able to navigate the facility without getting lost or locked out of critical areas." Reyes nodded and pulled out a laminated card from a drawer in his desk, handing it to me. It was a simplified facility map, color-coded to match the corridor signage, with emergency exit routes marked in bright yellow and assembly areas marked with red stars. "Keep this with you at all times," Reyes said. "If we have a lockdown or evacuation, follow the marked routes to the nearest assembly area and wait for security personnel to account for everyone before we proceed further. Do not deviate from marked routes. Do not attempt to enter restricted areas during emergencies. And most importantly, if you hear the klaxon alarm, 3 short blasts repeated, that means we have a containment breach. Get to the nearest sealed room and lock yourself in until the all clear is given. Containment breach." There was that phrase again, the one that appeared in all the liability waivers I'd signed, the one that suggested whatever research was being conducted here involved things that could escape, that could threaten facility personnel, that required emergency protocols beyond standard fire or medical evacuation procedures. I asked what type of containment breach I should be prepared for: chemical, biological, radiological. And Reyes exchanged a quick glance with Colonel Vance before responding. Multiple potential vectors, he said carefully. The specific details are compartmentalized. Just know that if you hear that alarm, you need to move fast and seal yourself somewhere safe. Security will handle threat neutralization. Your job is to stay alive so you can treat casualties after the situation is contained. The casualness with which he said threat neutralization sent a chill down my spine. That was language you used for enemy combatants, for hostile forces that needed to be eliminated rather than managed or evacuated. What exactly were they doing to these volunteers that might require lethal force to contain? I opened my mouth to ask, but Vance was already moving again, already ushering me out of the security office with the explanation that we needed to complete the tour so I could get settled in my quarters before dinner. I followed him back into the corridor, my mind racing through implications and possibilities, none of them good, all of them suggesting that I'd walked into something far worse than unethical medical research. My quarters turned out to be small but comfortable. A room maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, containing a twin bed, a desk with chair, a locker for personal items, and a small private bathroom with shower. The walls were painted institutional beige, the floor was polished concrete, and there were no windows because we were deep underground. A clock on the wall showed 7:43 hours. I'd been in the facility for almost 2 hours, though it felt both longer and shorter than that, time taking on a weird elastic quality in this place where natural light didn't penetrate and every space looked essentially the same. Colonel Vance explained that meals were served in a common dining area 3 times daily, that there was a small recreation room with television and exercise equipment, that I was expected to maintain normal duty hours unless called for emergencies, and that I should report to the medical suite at 7:30 hours tomorrow morning to begin my regular schedule. Then he left me alone in my quarters, the door closing with a heavy click that I realized after a moment was the sound of an electronic lock engaging. I tried the handle and confirmed my suspicion. The door was locked from the outside. I wasn't a guest here. I was a prisoner, or close enough that the distinction didn't matter. My security badge might grant me access to certain areas of the facility, but I couldn't leave my own room without someone unlocking the door from outside. I stood there for a long moment, processing this revelation, feeling the walls of the small room close in around me like a tomb. Then I heard another click, and the door unlocked, and a voice came through a speaker I hadn't noticed mounted near the ceiling. Staff Sergeant Holloway, rooms are secured during non-duty hours for safety protocols. Your badge will grant you access to exit your quarters between 05:30 and 2200 hours daily. If you require access outside those hours, contact security via the intercom button next to your door. So I wasn't a prisoner exactly, just someone whose movement was restricted for safety protocols. Another euphemism in a facility that seemed to run on euphemisms and carefully managed information. I sat down on the bed, which was surprisingly comfortable, military grade, but with a decent mattress and clean sheets that smelled like industrial laundry detergent. My gear was still on my back, my rifle still slung across my chest, and I realized I probably looked ridiculous sitting on a bed in full combat loadout. I started stripping off my equipment, methodically removing my plate carrier and load-bearing gear, clearing my weapons and securing them in the locker, stowing my assault pack and personal items. The routine was comforting, giving my hands something to do while my mind continued processing everything I'd learned in the past few hours. I'd been sent to a classified facility that officially didn't exist, buried underground in the Colorado wilderness, conducting human performance enhancement research on volunteers who were housed in a secured area that required containment breach protocols. The previous medical officer had departed 6 weeks ago and hadn't been immediately replaced. The facility had experienced some kind of incident the previous night that required emergency security measures. The forest surrounding the installation was empty of wildlife and filled with fog that didn't behave according to natural laws. And something in that forest had made Captain Chen and her team move with combat alertness. Weapons at ready, expecting contact with threats that were nothing natural. I pulled out my journal and started writing, documenting everything I'd observed and experienced, creating a record that might someday be useful if I survived whatever the hell I'd gotten myself into. The act of writing helped organize my thoughts, helped transform vague unease into concrete observations that I could analyze and evaluate. I wrote about the weird atmospheric phenomena in the meadow, the temperature drop despite sunrise, the fog that moved purposefully, the complete absence of wildlife. I wrote about the shape I'd seen in the forest during the escort, the impossible proportions and the way it had simply disappeared rather than moving away. I wrote about the facility architecture, the heavy blast doors and security protocols and locked rooms, the sense that everything here was designed to contain something rather than protect against external threats. I wrote about Colonel Vance's careful phrasing and Master Sergeant Reyes's warning about containment breaches and threat neutralization. And I wrote about my own growing conviction that I needed to find out what was really happening here, needed to understand what these volunteers were being subjected to, needed to decide whether I was going to go along with it, or find some way to expose it, or at the very least, survive it with my conscience and my sanity intact. A knock on my door interrupted my writing. I checked my watch, 0815 hours, and called out, asking who it was. A muffled voice responded, "Dr. Klein, Colonel Vance asked me to introduce myself and provide you with an overview of the research protocols you'll be supporting." I stowed my journal in my locker, made sure it was secured, and opened the door to find a man standing in the corridor, early 50s, wearing a white lab coat over civilian clothes, khaki pants, and a button-down shirt, with a laminated security badge hanging around his neck that showed a clearance level significantly higher than mine. He extended his hand for a shake and gave me a smile that looked genuine, or at least well-practiced, warm enough to put people at ease without committing to any actual emotional connection. "Marcus, right? Or do you prefer Holloway? I'm Richard Klein, Chief Researcher for Project Chrysalis. Welcome to Alpha 7. I know the orientation process can be a bit overwhelming. Lots of security protocols and bureaucratic paperwork. But I wanted to take a few minutes to explain what we're actually doing here so you understand the importance of the work and your role in supporting it." He spoke with the kind of easy confidence that came from years of academic lecturing. His voice modulated and pleasant, his body language open and non-threatening. But his eyes were sharp, constantly assessing, measuring my reactions to his words in ways that suggested he was as much a psychologist as a researcher. I invited him into my room and we sat, me on the bed and him in the desk chair, and I prepared to hear whatever carefully crafted narrative he'd been authorized to share with me. Project Chrysalis. Dr. Klein began, is an advanced human performance optimization program focused on developing enhanced cognitive and physical capabilities in military personnel. We're exploring the limits of human potential through a combination of pharmaceutical interventions, neurological stimulation, psychological conditioning, and controlled stress exposure. The goal is to create soldiers who can operate at peak efficiency for extended periods under conditions that would incapacitate ordinary personnel. Extreme cold, extreme heat, sleep deprivation, high-altitude operations, extended combat exposure without psychological breakdown. Think of it as taking everything we know about human physiology and psychology and pushing it to the absolute limits to see what's possible. It sounded like something out of a science fiction novel, the kind of super soldier program that conspiracy theorists love to talk about on late-night radio shows and obscure internet forums. But the way Dr. Klein described it, with clinical precision and absolute confidence, made it clear this wasn't theoretical speculation. This was active research with real human subjects undergoing real interventions. I asked him to be more specific about the pharmaceutical interventions, and he pulled a tablet from his lab coat pocket, swiping through screens until he found what he was looking for. We're using a combination of compounds, some derived from existing medications and some synthesized specifically for this program. Modafinil and armodafinil for wakefulness promotion. Methylphenidate derivatives for cognitive enhancement. Beta blockers for stress response modulation. Nootropic stacks combining racetams with choline sources. And several experimental compounds that I can't discuss in detail due to classification restrictions. The list was disturbing, but not entirely surprising. The military had been experimenting with performance-enhancing drugs since at least World War II, when amphetamines were routinely distributed to pilots and soldiers to maintain alertness during extended operations. Modern research had simply expanded the pharmacological toolbox, developing more targeted compounds with fewer side effects and greater efficacy. What worried me was the phrase experimental compounds and the classification restrictions that prevented Dr. Klein from explaining what those compounds actually did or what risks they posed to the subjects taking them. I asked about informed consent, about whether subjects were fully briefed on potential side effects and long-term health risks, and Klein nodded enthusiastically like he'd been expecting the question and had a prepared answer ready. Absolutely. Every subject goes through an extensive informed consent process that includes multiple briefings, written documentation, medical screening to ensure they're appropriate candidates, and psychological evaluation to confirm they understand what they're agreeing to and are making the decision voluntarily. We exclude anyone with significant medical or psychiatric history. We monitor them continuously throughout the program. And we maintain detailed records of every intervention and every observed effect, so we can adjust protocols if we detect any concerning trends. This isn't some rogue operation, Marcus. We have oversight from DoD medical ethics boards, regular audits from outside agencies, and strict protocols governing every aspect of the research. The words sounded right, but the delivery felt wrong, like Klein was reciting a script he'd memorized rather than describing actual practices he believed in. I've conducted medical ethics training dozens of times over my career, taught junior medics about the importance of informed consent and patient autonomy and the difference between research that advances medical knowledge and experimentation that crosses ethical boundaries. And everything about Dr. Klein's description set off alarm bells in my head. The classification restrictions that prevented full disclosure, the isolation of subjects in secured housing, the containment breach protocols that suggested things went wrong here with sufficient frequency that emergency procedures were necessary. The complete absence of any external contact or oversight that I could verify. All of it pointed toward a program that operated in the shadows precisely because it couldn't survive scrutiny in the light. But I couldn't say any of that to Dr. Klein. Couldn't challenge him directly without risking my access to information and potentially my safety. So I nodded thoughtfully and asked about the specifics of my role, about what kind of medical monitoring I'd be conducting and what parameters I should be watching for. Klein seemed pleased by my apparent acceptance and launched into a detailed explanation of the assessment protocols, weekly examinations including full vital signs, blood pressure monitoring, cardiovascular stress testing, neurological examination, cognitive function screening using standardized instruments like the Montreal Cognitive Assessment and various memory tests, blood draws for analysis of kidney and liver function and various neurochemical markers, urinalysis for metabolic screening, and psychological interviews to assess mood, anxiety levels, sleep quality, and any evidence of psychiatric side effects. You'll document everything in the medical records system, Klein explained, tapping his tablet to pull up what looked like a proprietary electronic health record interface. Each subject has a unique identifier. We don't use names in the documentation to maintain privacy, and you'll enter your findings under the appropriate subject ID after each assessment. The system automatically flags any values that fall outside normal parameters and generates alerts that get sent to me and to Colonel Vance so we can make decisions about protocol adjustments. If you observe anything that concerns you from a medical standpoint, signs of organ damage, neurological symptoms, psychological decompensation, anything that suggests a subject is experiencing adverse effects, you document it in the system and notify me immediately so we can intervene. I asked how many subjects were currently enrolled in the program, and Klein consulted his tablet before answering. 14 active participants at present. We typically maintain between 12 and 16 subjects at any given time, with subjects cycling through the program in cohorts. Each cohort undergoes a 6-month protocol, including baseline assessment, gradual pharmaceutical introduction, stress exposure trials, performance testing, and then a washout period where we monitor for any delayed effects. Your weekly assessments will be staggered, so you're seeing 2 or 3 subjects per day, which should be manageable alongside your regular sick call duties for facility personnel. 14 human beings locked in subject housing, undergoing 6 months of experimental drug trials and stress exposure that required containment breach protocols. I felt sick thinking about what that actually meant, what kind of interventions qualified as stress exposure trials in a facility this secretive and this heavily secured. I asked if I could meet the subjects before beginning formal assessments, just to introduce myself and establish rapport, and Klein hesitated for the first time in our conversation. That's not standard protocol. We try to maintain professional distance between medical staff and subjects to prevent the development of personal relationships that might compromise objective assessment. You'll interact with them during the scheduled examinations, but otherwise they're managed by dedicated research assistants and security personnel. Colonel Vance can explain the reasoning behind this policy better than I can. It has to do with maintaining program security and preventing any potential collaboration or information sharing that could jeopardize operational security. In other words, they didn't want me developing sympathy for the subjects, didn't want me seeing them as human beings with names and stories and families, didn't want me asking questions about how they'd been recruited or what they'd been told or whether they truly understood what they'd agreed to. The dehumanization was deliberate, a psychological barrier designed to make it easier for me to participate in whatever was being done to these 14 people. I thought about the experiments I'd learned about in medical ethics training. The Tuskegee study where black men with syphilis were left untreated for decades so researchers could study disease progression. The Willowbrook experiments where mentally disabled children were intentionally infected with hepatitis. The CIA's MK-Ultra program that dosed unwitting subjects with LSD and other drugs to study mind control techniques. All of them had operated under the assumption that the subjects weren't quite fully human, weren't quite deserving of the same ethical protections as the researchers and administrators who made decisions about their lives and bodies. Dr. Klein stood up, apparently satisfied that he'd provided sufficient orientation, and headed toward the door. Your first assessment is scheduled for tomorrow at 1,000 hours. I'll meet you at the subject housing entrance and escort you through the initial examination so you can familiarize yourself with the procedures. In the meantime, get settled in, grab some food from the dining facility, maybe get some rest. I know the travel and the altitude can be exhausting, and you'll want to be sharp for tomorrow. He gave me that practiced smile again and left, the door closing behind him with that same heavy click of the electronic lock engaging. I sat in the silence of my small room, staring at the beige walls, feeling the weight of the earth above me like a physical pressure on my chest. I stayed in my quarters for another hour, unpacking my personal items, organizing my gear in the locker, trying to process everything I'd learned and develop some kind of plan for how I was going to handle the next 6 to 8 weeks. The smart thing to do would be to keep my head down, perform my assigned duties without asking too many questions, collect my pay and get out when the rotation ended. That's what most people would do in my situation. But I'd spent 14 years in the military learning that following orders wasn't always the right thing to do, that sometimes you had to make hard choices between obedience and conscience, that the uniform and the rank structure didn't absolve you of personal moral responsibility. If something genuinely unethical was happening here, and everything I'd seen suggested it was, then I had an obligation to document it, to gather evidence, to find some way to expose it, even if doing so destroyed my career and put me at legal risk. At 0930 hours, I decided to explore the facility, to use my newly activated security badge to see what areas I could access and what I might learn from casual observation. I exited my quarters, The door unlocked automatically when I waved my badge near the card reader and headed down the corridor toward the common areas marked in green on my facility map. The dining facility turned out to be a large room with maybe a dozen tables, a serving line with hot food kept in warming trays, and a small seating area with couches and a television mounted on the wall. 3 people were in the room when I arrived, all wearing civilian clothes, all looking up when I entered, before quickly returning their attention to their meals or their phones. The body language was defensive, closed off, the way people act when they don't want to be approached or engaged in conversation. I got a tray and loaded it with scrambled eggs, bacon, hash browns, and coffee, standard institutional food that looked edible if not particularly appetizing. The eggs were powdered, reconstituted and cooked in large batches, but they were hot and salted adequately. The bacon was crispy, probably cooked earlier and kept warm rather than fresh made. The hash browns were from frozen, perfectly uniform shredded potato cylinders that all institutional kitchens seem to source from the same mysterious supplier. The coffee was strong and bitter, brewed in large urns and sitting long enough to develop that characteristic burnt edge that came from extended heat exposure. I sat at an empty table and ate mechanically while watching the other occupants of the dining facility from my peripheral vision. 2 of them were clearly researchers or technical staff, both men in their 30s or 40s, wearing business casual clothes, working on laptops while they ate, occasionally exchanging quiet comments I couldn't quite hear. The 3rd was a woman, maybe mid-20s, wearing what looked like medical scrubs, eating alone and staring at her phone with the glazed expression of someone scrolling social media to avoid thinking about their surroundings. None of them made eye contact with me. None of them introduced themselves or welcomed me to the facility. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the quiet clinking of utensils on plates and the low murmur of the television playing some morning news program with the volume turned down low. I finished my meal and deposited my tray in the designated collection area, then wandered into the adjacent recreation room that my facility map indicated should be nearby. It was smaller than the dining facility, maybe 15 feet by 20 feet, containing a treadmill, an elliptical machine, a small weight bench with dumbbells, and a worn couch facing another television. The equipment looked well used but maintained, the kind of basic fitness gear you'd find in any military facility where personnel needed to maintain physical readiness standards. No one else was in the room, which gave me an opportunity to examine it more carefully for anything that might provide insight into the facility's real purpose or the people who worked here. A bulletin board on one wall contained the usual administrative notices, safety protocols, emergency procedures, duty roster for facility maintenance, a calendar showing the current month with various dates marked for equipment inspections and supply deliveries. Nothing particularly interesting or revealing. A bookshelf in the corner held maybe 24 paperbacks, the kind of popular fiction and self-help books that accumulate in communal spaces when people leave behind volumes they've finished reading. I scanned the titles, several Tom Clancy novels, some science fiction by authors I didn't recognize, a few romance novels with lurid covers, multiple copies of books about mindfulness and meditation and stress management. That last category was interesting. The proliferation of stress management books suggested that facility personnel struggled with the psychological burden of whatever they were doing here, needed help coping with the moral or emotional weight of their work. I pulled one of the meditation books from the shelf and flipped through it, finding passages highlighted in yellow marker and marginal notes written in cramped handwriting. One passage near the middle of the book had been heavily marked. Guilt is a useless emotion that serves only to paralyze us. We must accept that difficult decisions often require us to act in ways that seem wrong, but are necessary for the greater good. The path to peace is through acceptance, not through endless self-recrimination. Someone had underlined "necessary for the greater good" multiple times, and written in the margin, "Remember this. Remember why we're doing this. It matters." The handwriting was shaky, suggesting either haste or emotional distress, and the page was slightly wrinkled like it had gotten wet, from tears maybe, or from being handled with sweaty, anxious fingers. I replaced the book on the shelf and continued my exploration, heading toward the medical level to familiarize myself with the spaces I'd be working in. The corridor was empty, my footsteps echoing on the polished concrete floor, the fluorescent lights overhead creating that peculiar timeless quality where it could have been morning or midnight or any hour in between. I used my badge to access Examination Room 1 and spent 20 minutes conducting a more thorough inventory of supplies and equipment, confirming that everything I might need for routine medical care was present and functional. The computer system required a login that I didn't yet have credentials for. I'd need to get that sorted out with Colonel Vance or Dr. Klein before I could access patient records or document my assessments. While I was checking the crash cart medications, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. I stuck my head out to see who was passing and caught a glimpse of Captain Chen moving quickly toward the far end of the medical level, toward those double doors marked Subject Housing, Authorized Personnel Only. She was in full combat gear again, rifle at low ready, moving with purpose and obvious tension. I called out to her, but she either didn't hear me or chose to ignore me, pushing through the double doors and disappearing from view. The doors swung shut behind her with a heavy thunk that suggested they were reinforced and secured, probably requiring special clearance to access. I stood in the corridor for a moment, debating whether to follow, whether to try my badge on the access reader beside those doors to see if I'd been granted entry yet. Before I could decide, an alarm began to sound. Not the three-blast klaxon that Master Sergeant Reyes had warned me indicated a containment breach, but a different pattern, 2 short blasts followed by a pause, repeating continuously. The overhead lights switched from normal white fluorescence to red emergency lighting, transforming the corridor into something from a horror movie, all crimson shadows and harsh contrasts. A voice came over the facility intercom system, calm but authoritative. All personnel. This is a code blue medical emergency. Medical staff report immediately to subject housing. All non-essential personnel shelter in place in your current location. This is a code blue medical emergency. The message repeated twice more while I stood frozen in the corridor, my medic training warring with my complete lack of knowledge about what a code blue meant in this facility or what I was supposed to do about it. Then the double doors burst open and Captain Chen backed through them, her rifle now at high ready, pointing back into subject housing at something I couldn't see. She was shouting into her radio. Sierra 6, Sierra 2, we need backup at subject housing immediately. Subject has breached containment and is non-responsive to verbal commands, preparing to deploy less lethal. Stand by. She spotted me standing in the corridor, and her eyes went wide. Holloway, get the fuck out of here. Get back to your quarters and lock yourself in. But even as she said it, I saw movement in the doorway behind her, saw something lurch through the opening, and every instinct I'd developed over 14 years in the military told me that running away wasn't an option because whatever was coming through that door was going to be faster than me, and I needed to see what it was, needed to understand what I'd gotten myself into. The figure that emerged from subject housing looked human at first glance. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, bipedal locomotion. But the proportions were wrong in subtle ways that my brain struggled to process. The arms were too long, extending past the knees when they hung at the sides. The torso was too narrow, compressed from side to side like someone had squeezed it in a vice. The head was elongated vertically, the skull stretched upward in a way that violated basic human anatomy. And the skin, Jesus Christ, the skin, was waxy and translucent, almost glowing in the red emergency lighting, revealing shadows of bones and organs beneath the surface that shouldn't have been visible through healthy tissue. The eyes were the worst part. They were too large, taking up maybe a third of the face, and they reflected the emergency lights like an animal's eyes caught in headlights, glowing with an inner luminescence that couldn't be natural. The figure moved with a lurching, uncoordinated gait, like it was learning how to operate its body for the first time, each step deliberate and awkward. It opened its mouth and made a sound that my brain initially tried to categorize as speech, but wasn't quite. More like someone had taken phonemes and rearranged them into random sequences that almost formed words, but didn't quite achieve meaning. Captain Chen fired her rifle, the shot impossibly loud in the enclosed corridor, the muzzle flash bright even in the red lighting. I saw the round impact center mass, saw the figure stagger from the kinetic energy transfer, saw what should have been catastrophic damage to vital organs. But the figure didn't go down. It didn't even seem particularly bothered by the wound. It just oriented on Chen and lurched toward her with increasing speed, those two long arms reaching out with obvious predatory intent. My training took over before my conscious mind could fully process what I was seeing. I moved forward rather than back, closing distance with the threat because that's what you do in close quarters when retreat isn't an option. You get inside their reach, you control the engagement, you use aggression to seize initiative. I had my M17 pistol out and up without consciously deciding to draw it, muscle memory taking over. Front sight finding center mass on the approaching figure. I fired twice, controlled pairs the way I'd been trained. 2 rounds in quick succession aimed at the thoracic cavity where heart and lungs should be. Both rounds hit. I saw the impacts. Saw the skin rupture and fluid that wasn't quite blood spray from the entry wounds. But again, the figure barely reacted, just shifted its attention from Chen to me, those massive eyes fixing on my position with predatory focus. Captain Chen was screaming into her radio, her voice high and tight with stress. Lethal force authorized, repeat, lethal force authorized. Subject is non-responsive to small arms fire. Requesting immediate backup. And then more figures were emerging from subject housing, 3 more, all with the same wrong proportions and waxy translucent skin and 2 large eyes, all moving with that same lurching gait. One of them was making a sound like laughter, high-pitched and manic, that set my teeth on edge and made my skin crawl with primitive terror. Another was doing something with its 2 long arms, moving them in patterns that seemed to have geometric significance, like it was tracing symbols in the air. The third was just staring at me with those luminous eyes, its mouth hanging open to reveal teeth that were too numerous and too sharp to be human. I emptied the rest of my magazine into the closest figure. 15 more rounds of 9mm FMJ, full metal jacket, ammunition at a range of less than 10 meters, shots that should have been devastatingly effective. I saw multiple impacts, saw the waxy skin rupture in a dozen places, saw that not quite blood spray and spatter, and the figure just kept coming, kept lurching toward me with those arms outstretched. I performed a combat reload, dropping the empty magazine and seating a fresh one from my belt, racking the slide to chamber the first round, bringing the pistol back up to ready position. Captain Chen was firing in controlled bursts now. 3-round sequences at cyclic rate, her M4 set to burst fire instead of semi-auto. The corridor was filled with muzzle flash and the deafening hammering of multiple weapons firing in an enclosed space, and the acrid smell of cordite and the wet sounds of bullets impacting flesh. And then Master Sergeant Reyes came through the double doors with 3 more security personnel, all of them carrying weapons I hadn't seen before. Some kind of heavy rifle with an unusually large bore, maybe 12-gauge shotgun or larger, firing rounds that produced much more dramatic effects than our standard 5.56 meters and 9mm ammunition. The first shot hit the lead figure center mass and literally blew it backward. The kinetic energy transfer sufficient to lift it off its feet and slam it against the corridor wall with bone-breaking force. The second shot took the head off another figure, the massive projectile. I could see now it was some kind of specialized slug, probably hardened steel or tungsten, vaporizing the skull in a spray of bone fragments and brain tissue and that weird translucent fluid. The third shot went low, impacting legs, shattering femurs and knees, and dropping a figure to the floor where it writhed and made sounds that might have been screaming if they'd been produced by human vocal cords. The firefight lasted maybe 90 seconds from start to finish. When it was over, 4 figures lay in the corridor in various states of destruction, their waxy skin already beginning to dissolve or decay or transform into something else, the translucent quality fading as whatever unnatural process had sustained them failed. The smell was overwhelming, not the coppery tang of human blood and the shit smell of perforated bowels that I was familiar with from combat casualties, but something chemical and wrong, like battery acid, mixed with spoiled meat and ozone from electrical burns. I stood in the aftermath with my pistol still at ready position, my ears ringing from the gunfire, my hands shaking from adrenaline dump, trying to understand what the fuck I'd just witnessed. Colonel Vance appeared from somewhere, moving down the corridor with 4 more security personnel, surveying the carnage with an expression that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd seen something like this. He looked at me, at Captain Chen, at Master Sergeant Reyes, taking stock of who was injured and who was still combat effective. "Status report," he barked, and Reyes responded with professional brevity. 4 subjects neutralized, no friendly casualties, containment restored, subject housing is being secured now. Vance nodded and turned to me. "Holloway, are you injured?" I checked myself quickly. No pain, no blood, no obvious wounds. I shook my head. "Good. Captain Chen, get him to the debriefing room. Master Sergeant Reyes, I want a full after-action report in 30 minutes. Get these bodies to the incinerator before they start phase transition. Move." Phase transition. I didn't know what that meant, but I didn't like the sound of it. Captain Chen grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the scene, steering me down a side corridor I hadn't explored yet, her grip tight enough to leave bruises. She didn't speak until we'd put 2 blast doors between us and the carnage in the medical level. Then she stopped, released my arm, and looked at me with eyes that contained so much weariness and barely suppressed trauma that I wondered how long she'd been assigned to this facility and how many times she'd experienced scenes like the one we'd just survived. The debriefing room was another windowless concrete box, maybe 12 feet square, containing a metal table bolted to the floor and 4 metal chairs that looked like they'd been salvaged from an elementary school cafeteria. Captain Chen deposited me in one of the chairs and then left without another word, the door locking behind her with that now familiar heavy click. I sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes, my mind replaying the firefight over and over, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, trying to reconcile the evidence of my own eyes with everything I understood about human biology and physics and reality itself. Those figures had looked human but moved wrong, had been shot multiple times with small arms fire that should have been instantly incapacitating but barely slowed them down, had produced sounds that approximated speech but weren't quite language. And their skin, that waxy, translucent skin that glowed in the emergency lighting and showed shadows of organs beneath. What the hell kind of pharmaceutical intervention or stress conditioning could produce that? The door opened and Dr. Klein entered, looking considerably less composed than he had during our earlier conversation. His lab coat was missing, his shirt was untucked, and his face had a gray pallor that suggested extreme stress or lack of sleep or both. He sat down across from me and placed a digital recorder on the table between us, checking that it was running before speaking. "Staff Sergeant Holloway, I need you to provide a detailed account of what you observed during the incident in the medical corridor, starting from when you first heard the code blue alarm. This interview is being recorded for security purposes and may be used in subsequent investigations. Please be as specific and accurate as possible." His voice carried none of the warm confidence from our earlier meeting. Now he just sounded tired and scared, and maybe a little bit broken. I described everything I'd seen, starting from my exploration of the medical level, and ending with Colonel Vance's arrival and his orders to dispose of the bodies before phase transition occurred. "Doctor." Klein listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a tablet, his expression growing more troubled as I described the figure's resistance to small arms fire and the eventual effectiveness of the heavy rifles that Reyes and his team had employed. When I finished, Klein was silent for a long moment, apparently organizing his thoughts before responding. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "What you witnessed was a cascading failure of the pharmaceutical protocol we've been developing. The subjects you saw, they were volunteers who agreed to participate in our enhancement program. But something went wrong with the latest batch of compounds. Instead of optimizing their physical and cognitive performance, the drugs triggered a transformation we didn't anticipate and couldn't control. Transformation. Not injury, not side effect, not adverse reaction. Transformation. The phrasing suggested that what I'd witnessed wasn't accidental. but rather an expected possibility that the researchers had been aware of and had decided to risk anyway. I asked Dr. Klein to explain what he meant by transformation, and he seemed to struggle with how much to reveal, his eyes darting to the recorder, and then back to me like he was calculating what he could say that would satisfy my questions without revealing classified information. Finally, he said, "The compounds we've been developing work by modifying gene expression in targeted tissues. They activate dormant genetic sequences that exist in all human DNA but are normally suppressed through epigenetic mechanisms. The goal was to access latent capabilities, enhanced regeneration, improved sensory processing, increased muscle efficiency, that sort of thing. But in some subjects, the activation cascades beyond our ability to control it, triggering expression of genetic material that produces unexpected phenotypes. Phenotypes. Scientific language to describe the horror I'd witnessed, the transformation of human beings into something that barely resembled human beings anymore. I asked how long the program had been producing these transformations, and Klein hesitated again, before admitting that they'd observed similar effects in previous cohorts, but had believed they'd solved the problem with adjusted dosing protocols. Clearly, they'd been wrong. I asked how many subjects had transformed, and Klein said that 4 subjects in the current cohort had shown signs of transformation over the past 72 hours, which explained the incident that had kept me waiting in the meadow for 2 hours this morning. The facility had been dealing with the initial outbreak while I stood in the cold wondering why nobody had come to collect me. I asked what happened to subjects who transformed, and Klein's expression became even more haunted. "Termination," he said quietly. "Once the transformation progresses beyond a certain threshold, it's irreversible and incompatible with human consciousness. The subjects lose all cognitive function and higher reasoning. They become purely instinctive, driven by base urges we don't fully understand. Violent, unpredictable, extremely difficult to contain. Our protocols require immediate termination before they can harm themselves or others. The bodies are incinerated to prevent any possibility of the modified genetic material escaping into the environment." He said all this in a flat, affectless tone, like he was describing proper disposal procedures for hazardous waste, rather than the systematic execution of human beings who'd volunteered for research that had turned them into monsters. I felt rage building in my chest, hot and righteous, and barely controlled. These researchers had taken 14 human beings and dosed them with experimental compounds that had a known risk of triggering catastrophic transformation, had watched subjects lose their humanity and their minds, had killed them when the transformation became inconvenient, and had called it all research, like that word sanctified the profound moral violation involved. I asked Dr. Klein how he slept at night, how he looked at himself in the mirror knowing what he was doing to these people. And he met my eyes with something that might have been shame or might have been defiance or might have been both. "Because the alternative is worse," he said. "Because if we don't develop these capabilities, our adversaries will. Because the next war won't be won by conventional forces, but by whoever can push human performance beyond current limitations. Because I've seen the intelligence reports about what China and Russia are doing in their black sites, and I'd rather we master this technology first, even if it means making sacrifices that keep me awake at night." The utilitarian justification, the greater good argument, the same reasoning that had been used to defend every atrocity in human history. I told Dr. Klein that he was rationalizing participation in crimes against humanity, that informed consent obtained through coercion or deception wasn't truly informed, that no amount of national security necessity justified torturing people to death in the name of science. He didn't argue, just sat there looking miserable and exhausted, and eventually said, "You're right. You're absolutely right. But it doesn't matter what I think or what you think. The program has authorization from the highest levels of the Department of Defense. We're operating under legal directives that we can't refuse without facing court-martial or worse. So we do our jobs, and we document everything, and we try to minimize the harm where we can, and we hope that history judges us less harshly than we probably deserve." The conversation was going nowhere productive. So I changed tack and asked about the subjects who hadn't transformed yet. The remaining 10, who were presumably still housed somewhere in subject housing, in various states of pharmaceutical modification. Dr. Klein explained that they'd immediately ceased all dosing protocols and placed the remaining subjects under intensive medical monitoring to watch for any early signs of transformation. My role would be to conduct daily assessments instead of weekly, checking vital signs and neurological function and looking for any of the warning indicators that had preceded the transformations in the other 4 subjects: skin discoloration, skeletal elongation, changes in eye morphology, cognitive decline, aggressive behavior. If I observed any concerning signs, I was to report immediately to Dr. Klein and Colonel Vance so they could make decisions about intervention. I asked what kind of intervention was possible once transformation began, and Klein admitted they didn't have any effective treatment options. They'd tried various pharmaceutical countermeasures to halt or reverse the genetic expression changes, but nothing had worked. Once transformation began, it progressed inexorably to the final stage I'd witnessed in the corridor, at which point termination was the only option. The best they could hope for was early detection so they could terminate subjects while they still retained enough human consciousness to potentially understand what was happening to them, though Klein acknowledged this was a cold comfort at best. I asked how subjects were terminated, and he said, humanely, with sedation, prior to lethal injection. Though I noted he wouldn't meet my eyes when he said it, which suggested the reality was probably less humane than he was claiming. The debriefing continued for another hour, Klein walking me through the specific assessment protocols I'd be expected to follow and the warning signs I needed to watch for. Skin changes. Any shift toward the waxy, translucent quality or any unusual luminescence. Skeletal changes. Elongation of limbs or spine. Changes in facial bone structure, particularly vertical elongation of the skull. Ocular changes, pupil dilation that didn't respond normally to light, changes in iris coloration, increased light reflection suggesting tapetum lucidum development. Behavioral changes, aggression, loss of language capability, regression to instinctive behavior patterns, failure to recognize familiar people or respond to social cues. Any of these signs in isolation might be insignificant, but multiple signs appearing together or progressing rapidly would indicate transformation was underway. By the time Dr. Klein finally turned off the recorder and released me from the debriefing room, it was well past 1400 hours, and I was mentally and emotionally exhausted. I returned to my quarters and collapsed on the bed, still in my blood-spattered uniform, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything I'd learned in the past few hours. I'd been sent to a facility conducting illegal human experimentation disguised as performance enhancement research. The experiments were producing catastrophic transformations that turned human beings into something monstrous and required their summary execution. The program was authorized at the highest levels of the Department of Defense and operated under classification protocols that prevented external oversight. And I was now complicit in it, expected to conduct medical assessments that would help identify which subjects needed to be killed before they became too dangerous to control. I should have refused. Should have told Colonel Vance and Dr. Klein that I wouldn't participate, that medical ethics and human decency required me to blow the whistle on this entire operation regardless of the personal consequences. But I was also terrified. I'd seen what happened to the transformed subjects, had watched them absorb multiple gunshots without going down, had seen the predatory intelligence in those 2 large eyes even as they lost their human consciousness. If I refused to cooperate, would they simply add me to the list of problems that needed to be terminated and incinerated? Was I effectively a prisoner here, trapped underground in a facility that didn't officially exist, surrounded by people who'd already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect operational security? I pulled out my journal and started writing again, documenting everything from the firefight to the debriefing with Dr. Klein, creating a record that might someday serve as evidence if I survived to share it with outside authorities. The act of writing helped impose order on chaos, helped transform raw emotional reaction into structured analysis. I wrote about the way the transformed subjects had moved, about the resistance to small arms fire, about the specialized ammunition that Reyes's team had used and how it had proven effective where conventional rounds had failed. I wrote about Dr. Klein's explanation of the genetic modification process and his admission that the transformations were a known risk that researchers had chosen to accept. I wrote about my own moral culpability and my growing conviction that I needed to find a way to expose this program, even if doing so destroyed my life.